Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about whitewater rafting and saving wild rivers with my guest, Childress. He has been a river guide, a rammed earth builder, a newspaper editor, and an elementary school teacher. His fourth grade students called him Mr. Chill. He has just written a wonderful new book, Bail, Bail, Bryce Whitmore and the Birth of Whitewater Rafting. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you, Nancy.
You wrote an incredible story of Bryce, who is considered to be the creator of a self-bailing raft back in the 70s. Before that, people went down rivers in wood boats, or they went down on old rafts from World War II that required a lot of bailing when they got full of water. Can you explain the change in the technology and how it really started the commercial whitewater rafting industry?
Yes, Bryce was a very ingenious fellow. He was a paint chemist when he left Ohio and got a job, Sears Paints, and he came to California, and he decided he didn't like being in a lab all day long. He wanted to be outside, so he started his company on the Sacramento River with a couple of pontoon rafts and John boat, a motorized motorboat in the middle, doing a run from Redding to Red Bluff. For $20, you could have 2 days on the river, camp out, barbecue, and sing along. And he kind of learned about that rig by working for Lou Elliott in Glen Canyon a number of years before. So he did those trips, and then he heard about the river called the Stanislaus in Calaveras County. He had a bunch of friends in the Sierra Club river touring section. He and his good buddy Maynard Munger did a quick kayak trip down the Stanislaus, only about 9 miles of the river from Camp 9 to Parrots Ferry Bridge. And it was such a beautiful river, deep limestone canyon with white sandy beaches, class 3 rapids, and made into a nice 2-day trip. So he bought some surplus life rafts in Seattle. They were called 15-man basket boats because they were designed to hold that many people in case their ship was torpedoed in the Second World War. He started with those, and they just needed bailing after every rapid. Otherwise, the boat would fill up with 3-4 feet of water, and you had to bail to get ready for the next rapid. So that's how I started with Bryce. My first trip was in 1963. After a number of rivers, he thought, how could he start doing more difficult rivers? And he took those original 2 big pontoons that he had bought and cut them in half to make 2 12-foot shorter pontoons. We'll actually make 4 of them because he started with the 2 long ones. Lashed them together and put on a frame, a rowing frame. That made the first self-bailing raft. He called it the Super Sport. With that raft, he was able to start exploring other rivers like the Tuolumne and the Illinois and other Class 5, Class 4 rapids, Class 6 being unrunnable.
But the rapids in Grand Canyon have a different rating system than those rapids here on the rivers in California.
That's correct. I rode dories, wooden dories, for Martin Litton in the Grand Canyon for a number of years, and that rating system goes from 1 to 10, and the biggest rapids in the Grand Canyon were Lava Falls and Crystal Rapid, which are both rated 10. But out west, it was a rating system from 1 to 6, and 6 just meant it hadn't been run yet. 5 was at the height of what was doable back then.
It's important that the river guides know how to maneuver the raft around the rapid so that the raft doesn't get caught, or the customers or the individuals in the rafts don't get thrown out of the raft. How did the Stanislaus get named?
The Stanislaus was named after a Yokuts Indian man who was taken to the Monterey mission by the Spanish when he was a still young man, along with his wife and mother. And it was more of a slavery condition there. He was big, described as muscular like a horse. He became trusted by the Padres there, and he became an overseer of the other Indian tribes that were at the mission. His original Yokuts name was Kukunuchi, but he was renamed Stanislaw after a Polish saint when he arrived at the mission. But he became less and less enthused about living there and learned military techniques by watching the soldiers at the San Francisco Presidio do pincher maneuvers and other type of war strategies. And eventually he and a group of the Indians left the mission, were given a chance to go home briefly. They were expected to come back, but they didn't. And he organized from 1,000 to 4,000 Indians from different tribes to resist a Spanish incursion on their homelands. The last battle they had, he would always defeat the Spanish soldiers and sent them packing after 3 expeditions. And finally Vallejo, Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, came on an expedition to where he was hiding out at the mouth of the Stanislaus and the San Joaquin rivers. You can still visit the site of his last stand in Caswell State Park. And they were turned back on their raft crossing the San Joaquin by a fuselage of arrows, and eventually snuck around and lit their stronghold on fire. They had dug bulwarks and could not be really dislodged from their sight, but eventually they had to leave. They never surrendered, but Stanislaus went back to the mission and was given a pardon there, and he died from smallpox about 1830. Most of this happened in the early 1800s.
There's so much history, but I really enjoyed some of your stories about how you wanted to go and be a river guide, and he said, get in the raft, and you said, how do I do this? And he just says, follow me. You tell the story about how he told you how to run a rapid that you'd never run before.
Yeah, well, it was kind of interesting because I had been on the Stanislaus as a passenger, and I was a passenger of Johnny Litton, who was Martin Litton's son. Johnny and I did a lot of things together growing up. Martin was the travel editor of Sunset Magazine, while my father was the staff photographer, so our families used to do a lot of trips together. And I went on with Johnny in 1963 down the Stanislaus on a trip with Bryce, and my dad went in Martin's raft. And that's when I first met Bryce, and I started entertaining the notion of becoming a river guide myself. So in 65, I gave him a call, asked if he'd be willing to try me out as a guide. And he said, sure, Ty, come on up to my place in El Sobrante and make it up here Friday afternoon about 5 o'clock. I said, sure, but I thought I would have a training trip when I got there, go down with another guide or to do a baggage boat. But I could read a little section here if you want.
Please do so.
See, it's May of 1965. As I slowly wake in the snug cocoon of my sleeping bag, I hear a rhythmic rumbling sound and wonder where I am. Then it comes back to me. I'm camped on the banks of the Stanislaus River. A shiver of fear runs through me. Is it too late to back out of this? The rumblings are coming from the first rapid, Cadillac Charlie, and I have no one to blame for being here but myself. And then I go on to kind of summarize what I just told you about giving Bryce a call and loading up the boxes and driving up to Vallecito, the little town near the Put-In. Our sleep on the sandy beach at Put-In is short. As I awaken, sunlight is just kissing the hilltops above the canyon. Hidden in the rocks above the river, a canyon wren trills its long, slow, descending laugh. A couple of the other guides are stirring, but Bryce is already busy loading waterproof boxes and setting out the passengers' life jackets and waterproof duffel bags. I get up and wonder what had possessed me. After a breakfast of cold cereal and a cinnamon sweet roll, Tom, Bob, Dorn, and I begin pumping up the Army surplus 15-man basket boats, equipping each with a rowing frame and oars. Our clothing is simple, a t-shirt, cut-off jeans, and tennis shoes. There are 5 boats and 5 guides, including Bryce and me. As the first passengers begin arriving at the bottom of the tortuous Camp 9 road, Bryce takes me aside and whispers, say, Ty, one of my guides didn't show up this weekend, so would you mind taking passengers down? Just stay close to me and pretend like you've done it before. If they ask you the name of a rapid, just make something up, like Killer Fang Falls. At that point, how could I say no? I'd always wanted to be a boatman. Years later, Bryce admitted using this technique to ensnare other aspiring young guides. It was a trial by water learning, the type of training Bryce preferred. Yep, that's how I did it. Sometimes I'd just have a guy and his girlfriend go down together. If they survived with their relationship intact, he was good to go. Next trip. We are the only boats on the river for the simple reason that no one else has thought of doing this yet. Bryce is the first. So not only did Bryce invent the first self-bailing raft, he invented river rafting in California.
And there were so many other companies that have followed in making these rivers a wonderful experience. I just enjoyed hearing you read that section again, because every page I read in this book brought me back to a wild river. It was interesting how you talked about the naming of the rapids.
Yeah, Bryce named a few to get our attention. It was Death Rock. He named that after a young man drowned. He was going in an inner tube, and it was tied to a piece of plywood that was lashed to the inner tube and got sucked under this big rock just above where Bryce was having lunch one day, and the fisherman ran up and saw this body floating down. So Bryce gave chase. They pulled the boy in, and he had drowned. The sheriff came down, and they took him out. Bryce named that rapid Death Rock just to get our attention. Be careful when you're going through there. He named several others: Widowmaker, Devil's Staircase, Daily Bailey's Falls was named after the first female kayaker to run the Stanislaus. Most of the rapids at the beginning, early times, were named by Bryce. Then other companies came along after 1965 and started naming some of the rapids their own names.
But every company is very concerned about safety. Now people wear helmets to protect themselves in case they do fall out, and they make sure that the whole experience is to enjoy not just the river and the thrill of a rapid, but even the quiet parts of a river where you can just lay back and look at the plants and see if you can see any of the wild animals, and then you stop and you can explore the caves and the other kinds of features on the land, the old mining sites. It's a wonderful experience, which interestingly, you could take a trip quickly 9 miles down a river in one day, but I know when I did the Stanislaus, we made it a 2-day trip so we could just experience the canyon and the river.
Yes, there's so much to do. You can jump off cliffs into the deep pools, rope swings, you can swing off, excellent fishing. There were miners that did sluice box mining, although that's been outlawed now. So it was a beautiful river to do in 2 or even 3 days if you wanted to take a nice slow trip down the river. I even did a moonlight trip once in the dark of night, guided just by the moonlight. When you'd go into the shadow of a cliff, you'd had to run the rapids by sound and memory.
Because often on the river trips that I've taken, from the Snake to the Salmon to the Rogue to the Green to the Colorado, when you approach a rapid, the raft usually stops and everybody gets out and decides if they're going to walk around it or go through it on the raft, and how the guide has to figure out how to go through it.
Yeah, the bigger ones we always stopped to scout. After a while on the Stanislaus, we became so familiar with the rapids that we didn't usually stop and scout. Maybe occasionally we would stop above Widowmaker and see if we're going to go left the normal route or try to go right. It was a tricky little chute you could go through. In the beginning years, we never wore life jackets. At least the guides didn't. The passengers always had a little horse collar life jacket, but the guides, Bryce thought it would give the passengers confidence in our abilities if we didn't wear life jackets. And the kind that we had at that time tended to get tangled up with your oars when you were rowing, so they were more of a hindrance than a help usually.
Technology has changed, and I know that over the years I was able to buy little rubber shoes so that I could go walking around on the river and not hurt my feet, and not wear tennis shoes or running shoes that were a little heavier if they got wet.
Yeah, technology has advanced, and they make very nice life jackets to stay close to your chest so they don't get in the way of rowing.
I'm looking at some gorgeous color photographs of the flora and fauna. You have a California poppy on the McCollum River. You have the seep monkey flower on the Calaveras River, a stonecrop on the Stanislaus, a Dutchman's pipe flower on the Tuolumne River, scarlet columbine on the Clavey Creek, and then you've got bald eagles and great blue herons, Canada goose, great horned owl, even black bears and box turtles and king snakes and bighorn sheep. There's so much to see in addition to the water, just looking around.
The riparian habitat is really the richest habitat there is. Reservoirs are among the most sterile, but you'll find just all sorts of life that depends on the river.
And of course, one should not pick these flowers so that they're there for others, and when one encounters some of the animals, one should not scare them so that they can carry on with their normal activity.
Yeah, the flowers need to go to seed, and it's tempting to pick a bouquet, but that does limit the seed production for the following year. Most of them are annuals.
The rock formations are fascinating. You've got basalt, you've got quartz, and on some of them you might even find pictographs.
Yes, there were pictographs on the Stanislaus that went under. Most other river canyons, Grand Canyon, the Green River, many other places in California, Arizona, Utah, you'll find beautiful pictographs and handprints that were made by the native person putting their hand up against the rock wall and spraying some kind of dye or paint over their hand and making a stencil.
Traditionally, the river guides were men, but women started doing it too. And it's not just a matter of strength, it's a matter of skill, isn't it?
Right. A lot of the male guides thought you really had to be beefy to go through these rapids, but that's mostly because they were maybe not as good at anticipating what the current was going to do to you. But a number of females began rafting for Bryce and Arda and other companies that came later, Jacqueline Dennis, Julie Munger, Barbara Brower. They all started rowing, some for Bryce and some for other companies. And they seemed to be much better because they didn't necessarily have the brawn at anticipating where to go and what was going to be happen. So they would row through these rapids with less effort and more elegantly than many of the male guides would.
The book that you wrote, Bail, Bryce Whitmore and the Birth of Whitewater Rafting, not only had great stories, but a lot of pictures of people in the rafts and in the rivers and how that has changed, and also some of the beautiful features that one might see, a cliff face on the San Juan River or an evening cliff face on the Green River. It must have been fun to look at some of these old pictures. You have yourself in a 1957 Ford paddle truck.
Yeah, that was my first vehicle. It's funny because I grew up with a camera around my neck. My father, as I said, was a professional photographer, and so from the time I was 8 years old, I just carried a camera with me. And so I had all these photographs of Bryce, of our early trips, of wildflowers, a lot of creatures that lived along the rivers. And I knew Bryce, and hardly anybody knew him. And I just felt like I was in this unique position that if I didn't write something about Bryce, I didn't know who would. Hardly anybody had heard of him. So I just put him together with the help of an excellent designer, Joyce Didini, who helped me put it into a book form.
I am so glad you got his story for all of us to read, know about. Such an inventor, such a creator, such a wonderful, kind person, and all the experiences of other people that we are going to talk about, rafting and saving wild rivers, when we return in a moment with my guest, Ty Childress.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Ty Childress, who was formerly a river guide and elementary school teacher, but is author of Bail, Bryce Whitmore and the Birth of Whitewater Rafting. In looking at the pictures, I see so many fun activities that make me want to get back on a river where there's a whole chain of people going down without a raft, down a creek, going over the rocks in the creek. And of course, you also had kayakers sometimes join along with the rafters. You have a picture of Rose Creek, which, as you say, rush hour. It's a traffic jam. There must be about 20 different rafts all gathered together there. These rivers have gotten very, very popular sometimes, and you have to kind of control when and where the rafts go.
Yeah, but originally, of course, there was no restrictions on river travel because the Forest Service and Bureau of Reclamation really had never seen this before. But in 1965, Martin Litton did a story for Sunset Magazine about Bryce's trips on the Stanislaus, and after that, a slew of other river companies started up and started doing trips, till eventually there were so many people on the water. Bryce said you probably could have jumped from raft to raft, from put in to takeout, without getting your feet wet, and that's kind of one of the things that soured him a little bit on the Stanislaus after a period of time.
It's like hiking in the wilderness nowadays. You have to get a permit so that the place isn't overrun. You get the experience of the wild.
Yes, and that's what happened on the rivers. Now there are permits for most of the wild rivers. All the wild and scenic rivers, you have to try to get a permit in advance, and that's hard to do on many of the rivers. We try to go down the Rogue River and the Salmon and the San Juan, but we really win the lottery to do that.
Here in California, how many rivers are there? How many are wild, or are there just sections left that haven't been disturbed by humans?
There are a few sections. The Tuolumne, Clavey Creek, they were protected in the Wild and Scenic River Act. The Kern, sections of the Kings. A lot of the rivers that Bryce pioneered have become protected largely through the efforts of Friends of the River. There are other rivers that still need protecting. The group of Klamath Indians recently was instrumental over a 20-year period in removing 4 old dams on the Klamath River, the Copco dams, and now salmon are returning to the upper reaches of the Klamath River that had previously been blocked from spawning up there.
You mentioned the Wild and Scenic River Act, and that was instrumental in protecting a lot of rivers. There are many more rivers throughout the country that need saving, aren't there?
Yes, indeed, and I'm afraid the current administration is not friend of conservation or river protection. A lot of the protections of federal sites has been rescinded to allow for oil drilling. It's not a pretty picture.
We've mentioned the Stanislaus so many times, and I do want to talk a little bit more about that because in the 70s I was very active here in Southern California in trying to get an initiative on the ballot to stop the new Malonis Dam. We had to collect signatures, and unfortunately, it was a problem for the voters because if you were against the dam, in other words, no for the dam, you had to vote yes on the initiative to stop the dam, and I think people got confused.
Yes, there was polling taken after the election. We lost by about 3 percentage points, but people were actually in favor of protecting the river, but people who were building the dam got a lot of money, put up billboards, called it a Wild River hoax. So we came down to Los Angeles. I understand you hosted Mark Dubois, who was one of the key figures in this fight with Friends of the River. We would have these banners painted on sheets and hang them over the overpasses at rush hour saying, vote yes on Prop 17. As I say, we lost it. Many of us were very sad and gave up. Mark Dubois was one who didn't give up.
In your book, you talk about Mark's effort in founding with other people that I worked with, the Friends of the River, to try and save the Stanislaus, not get it dammed. I found it particularly interesting that he felt so moved by the river that he was willing to give up his life. And I often tell people how he chained himself to a rock, but you explained that it was more than just a political stunt. He was very, very serious about loving that river enough to give up his life.
Yes, he was. I have known Mark for many years, and I interviewed him, of course, before doing the book. He knew he had to stop the reservoir from filling that spring or it would be lost. And so in dead of night, he took a mummy sleeping bag and a lock and a chain and hiked barefoot. He usually went around barefoot downstream to a hidden place on the edge of the reservoir. It had kind of an overhanging rock under a buckeye tree. And he had drilled a hole with a star bit, and he locked his chain around his ankle, broke his toe on the way down, hiking in the dark. Before he had done that, he had sent a letter to Colonel Daniel O'Shea, who was the head of the Army Corps, explaining what he was going to do. It's only a couple of feet above the reservoir level and was filling fast because it was spring and the snow melt was coming down. And a lot of people thought he was not really in danger. He was just a publicity hound and it was all a stunt. But the head of the Army Corps knew that he wasn't like that. He probably would do something, actually do that. Eventually he agreed to have the media come in and take pictures of him at night where he was hidden. He vowed to stay there. He didn't leave until the Army Corps had agreed to stop the spill of the reservoir and stop the filling before it got to him. Eventually he did come out. The day after he disappeared, I kayaked down around the reservoir calling out his name because I thought he ought to have some contact with the outside world in case he changed his mind and that he shouldn't drown. I didn't find out till later how I had paddled right next to his hidden place and hadn't seen him, and he hadn't responded because he knew I would probably give it away if somebody forced me to say, where is he? But at the time he actually had somebody, a friend of mine who was named Deep Paddle, who came in every night and brought him the latest news and updates. Turned out to be one of my best friends, Marty McDonnell, who ended up buying Bryce's company from him and now runs the Tuolumne River. So eventually they spilled the reservoir and Mark came out. The following year it filled up again. There was no way they could have stopped it. The dam should never have been built that tall. There was already a lower dam. They wanted to make it larger, but there was really no need for that much water. They didn't have contracts for the water. It was a fairly small catchment area, 888 square feet of catchment area for that watershed, and a very tall dam to do that. It's seldom full. Maybe 1 year in 8 does it fill up.
There's a large movement now, of course, to remove dams off of the rivers and hopefully restore some of these rivers back to their wildness, because the dams aren't providing the water or the hydropower that was projected. There's so much more value in keeping the rivers wild. The new Malonis Dam, are they tearing it down now?
No, but we're working on it. I'm part of a group called Restoring the Stanislaus River. We just took a bunch of people down the lower Stanislaus to show them what it looked like down near Oakdale area.
You have so many wonderful stories in your book. I want to have you share a little bit more about Bryce Whitmore, who you write led you and many other aspiring river guides to follow lives of riverine fervor. His first craft was a chunk of ice. I guess he took some ice down a river. His last was a wheelchair. He lived into his 90s, and in between he traveled by kayak, raft, canoe, sailboat, roller skates, ice skates, downhill skis, bicycle, race car, and a dynamite-laden truck with worn-out brakes. But you have provided a story not only of Bryce's adventures and inventiveness, but also one of growing old with grace and wit. You obviously shared a love of a man who loved the wild and loved helping other people enjoy nature. You obviously have carried on a wonderful friendship with this individual. What do you find that you want us to all know about him, other than that he did create this self-bailing raft and started commercial river rafting?
Yeah, he also invented the first fiberglass river kayak on the West Coast and anywhere in the U.S. But besides his inventiveness, he was just really a funny guy. He was always joking around. On the Rogue River, he would dress up in a bear costume and paddle an inner tube down below the lodges where the passengers were having their cocktails, or dress up as Superman and say, "Hey, has anybody seen a phone booth around here? I got a change." I have a little section here that illustrates his sense of humor.
Please share one more section with us.
Okay. Somewhere along the Klamath River, Bryce came upon a lovely old pressure gauge, about 5 inches in diameter and constructed by the Chas P. Marsh Corporation of Chicago. It was long disconnected from its original pressure tank. The gauge's scale registered from 0 to 200 psi, and its red needle could be turned manually to any point in between. He tucked it into his milk crate beside his seat and rode on. Besides being a pleasing addition to his collection of river memorabilia, Bryce saw in it the ready-made answer to the most common query passengers ask while on the river: how deep is the water? Longtime river guide and friend Fred Dennis once responded to this question by removing a tape measure from his belt and plunging it into the depths to take an actual, if constantly varying, reading. Bryce, when asked a fated question, would reach into the crate and surreptitiously adjust the needle to a plausible number, say 18, then hold up the rusty dial and say, "Oh, it's about 18 feet here." They were happy with that. This is a quote. They were happy with that. A couple of minutes later, "How deep is it here?" "Oh, it's getting shallower here. It's only 12 feet. They'd buy that the whole damn trip. That was the main thing they'd ask: how deep is it? Well, who cares? It's going to change every moment. The passenger's response was usually, "Oh, okay, thanks." But of course, a practical joke is not really a joke at all until someone recognizes it as such. Fortunately for Bryce, a passenger did catch on to his ruse at the lunch stop. He was a lawyer, kind of a suspicious fellow. He picked up that dial, turned it over in his hand, and pushed that needle around, looked at me and said, "Damn you, Bryce Whitmore."
I loved all these kinds of stories in your book and all the other people involved in river rafting. You've talked about Martin Linton's Grand Canyon Dories, Marty McDonald's Sierra Mac River Trips, John Vale's Outdoors Unlimited, Friends of the Rivers effort, and just the whole experience. One of the things that should be pointed out is that not only do you enjoy the nature, but you enjoy good cooking. Those river guides know how to make breakfast, lunch, and dinner seem like a 5-star restaurant.
Yeah.
I wish we had time to hear about all your stories, because they are so moving, so beautifully written, and bring back so many incredible experiences and memories. I wish we could hear more, so people will just have to go out and read Bail, Bryce Whitmore, and the Birth of Whitewater Rafting. How do they contact you? What's your website?
They can take a look at my website. That's www.tychildress, tychildress.com.
Perhaps because the Stanislaus was my first, it's my love, and perhaps because I wanted to save it. But all the other rivers I went on and have gone on, both in the United States and in other parts of the world, are exciting. Every river seems to be my favorite. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, I'd say it'd have to be the Stanislaus. Even though it's been lost, it was my first river and the one that I remember most fondly, but it's, of course, not there. The Illinois, Bryce said, was his favorite.
Where is the Illinois located?
The Illinois is in Oregon. It's a tributary of the Rogue River and joins the Rogue near the town of Agnes.
So the tributaries are as exciting sometimes as the main river, and obviously stopping on the rivers and walking up the creeks is exciting as well.
Oh, yes. Lots to explore on all these rivers. He was inducted into the International Whitewater Hall of Fame when he was 97.
The stories that you shared in your book are really enjoyable reading, and I want to thank you so very much for bringing these to our attention and sharing your love of the river and of the individuals who were so instrumental in creating the experience of whitewater rafting. Thank you for being my guest.
You're very welcome, Nancy. Thank you for interviewing me.
I have been speaking with Ty Childress, who is author of Bail, Bail, Bryce Whitmore, and the Birth of Whitewater Rafting. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.